Okay, so my name's Annette Ratuszniak, and I'm the curator of the Elisabeth Frink estate and archive, and the curator with Neil here of this exhibition. So what I'm mainly going to do is try and give snippets of information that I think might be useful, that I will hope that you will turn into your own interpretation. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Elisabeth Frink. She was born in 1930. Her father was in the army, so that meant she moved around a lot, but her grandparents lived in Suffolk. So most of her childhood was spent in Suffolk because her father might be stationed in other sort of places. So I tend to feel that that rural upbringing is very important to understanding Liz. Rural Suffolk before the Second World War was incredibly rural. You know, if you look at the demography, if you look at the sort of lives that were lived, it's very much a rural landscape with a lot of farming, a few sort of middle-sized sort of towns, and a lot of little market towns. So that's the sort of world that she grew up in. Her mother was a Catholic, and but before the war, there actually were not many Catholic churches in England. Sort of post-war, there's sort of quite a few. So as a child, she would be taken to the Church of England in the little village that she spent a lot of her time in, where her grandparents lived, which was called Little Thurlow. And so her father and her grandparents were Church of England. And I'm telling you this because she had lots of church commissions. And because she had those two experiences of Catholicism and Church of England, it meant that she was actually able to approach those commissions with some sort of depth of understanding. When she was 9, war broke out, and in terms of Britain, Suffolk and East Anglia was the place where they built a lot of the sort of bomber command airfields. And there was one called Stradis Hall, which is, you don't need to know names, but basically there was an airfield within striking distance of Little Thurlow, where she grew up. So as a young child, in the early years of the war, she had vivid memories of dogfights, so that's enemy planes and British and English planes fighting overhead in the skies with machine guns, planes falling out of the sky, all sorts of rather horrendous images and experiences for a young person. Eventually, once the Blitz started and the airfield started to be bombed, it was decided by her mother that she would move Liz and her brother. She had a younger brother called Tim, and she would move them down to Devon. So they were evacuated down to Devon to stay with a family friend for so-called safety. What the mother didn't know is that that there were going to be raids, what's known as the Baedeker raids, and in fact Coventry was a Baedeker raid. There were going to be raids on Exmouth and Exeter. So Liz was caught up in one of these and had very vivid memories of machine guns coming, aeroplanes coming out of the sea and machine gunning where she and her school friends were walking along the seafront, and them having to hide underneath a sort of, you know, coastal sort of shelter. So that was her experience of, as a young child, of growing up within the war, and that made a huge impact on her and therefore her approach to work. None of her family were artistic. They were sort of military or commercial or farming, and so after the war, for some reason, she decided that she wanted to be an artist. She'd always liked drawing, and when she was at Exmouth, she used to go to drawing classes actually at the local nunnery and in Exmouth. And so that's the path that she chose. And she went to Guildford. She went to Guildford School of Art, and when she was there, she decided that sculpture was her thing. So having left Guildford, she then went on to Chelsea and specialised in sculpture. And at the time in Chelsea, the senior sculpture tutors were somebody called Bernard Meadows and Willie Sukop. And they were her chief tutors, although people like Henry Moore and so on like that would come in. So Bernard Meadows had been assistant to Henry Moore, and before the Second World War there was a huge rise in interest in sculpture and making sculpture in Britain. So that's the time that you get Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth, and that all comes out of Leeds, which is not that far away. But they were very much into what was known as direct carving and truth to materials. So I won't go into that very much, but that is basically carving from a block. So you start with a block and then you reduce things and take it away until you arrive at a shape and a form. Bernard Meadows, having been an assistant to Henry Moore, did what all good assistants do and wanted to do something totally opposite. Like any good child wants to do something totally opposite to your parents. So he decided he and Willie Sukop looked more towards traditions in Europe, and they became very interested in working with plaster. So that is what Liz was taught when she was at college, and that is what she came to feel suited her way of thinking and her way of working. So she, in 9/10 of the, in fact pretty well all the way through, all her work is plaster based. So when you're working with a piece of plaster, come and have a look. So here we've got a little piece of plaster. You have to build a skeleton, and you can see on this very early running man figure where the plaster has fallen off, and you can see those metal, do you see the metal skeleton, the metal, what's called an armature. And so you make the shape in metal, and then you start to put the plaster on top of it. And that meant that you work very quickly, and Liz liked working very quickly. If you're carving, it's long and slow and laborious. With plaster building, you can work very quickly. You can have your bowl of wet plaster, you can have bits of rag, you can have bits of newspaper, you can have bits of broken wood, found objects anyway, so you can bulk it up, and then you can build up your form and your shape very quickly. So that's how Liz liked to work. And that is what you see in pretty well all the sculptures we've got here. Now, some people have said to me when they look at these, are all cast in, these are bronzes. The plaster gets cast into bronze. And later on when we get to the studio, I'll explain how that process works. So if anyone says to you, how, like they've said to me twice since I've been here, how do you carve bronze? Well, you don't carve bronze. You've got a solid lump of metal there, and I tell you what, that would not, you could not model that. So you have the plaster, you, in essence, you make a mould. If you think about something like an Easter egg, where you've got a shell, you make a mould that will allow you to have this shell, and then you pour molten bronze in, and then you take away the mould, and there's your bronze sculpture. Now, when it comes out of the mould, it does not look like these at all. It is shiny metal. So then you have to oxidize, what we call patinate the surface, and you do that with chemicals and heat, and that's how you get the colour. There are lots of different colours throughout the exhibition. So you have everything from white, brown, black, green, red, blue, all this range of colours that you can get. So what I wanted to do in this first gallery was introduce the ideas and the things that interested Liz, her passions. So for Liz, because of her experience during the war and because of after the war, you've still got huge things going on. You've got more wars starting in other parts of the world. You've got the Cold War starting between America and New York. You've got the dropping of the atom bomb, the dropping of nuclear testing and things like that. It's a very fragile world, and this fragile world has been created by us, the human species. So that's really what she wanted to talk about. And so then the artist is thinking, how am I going to express that? So she actually was very interested in what we call the figurative tradition. So she wanted to express her thoughts through images that we understand, that we recognize, not abstract images, but human form, animal form, heads, and then complex ideas where you're trying to explore different aspects perhaps of the same reflective inquiry through the metamorphosis of animal to bird, bird to man. So we have those 4 themes. So in this gallery we wanted to introduce the things that, the themes, the way that Liz worked, the way that she thought. And she arrived at those themes as things that mattered to her the most right at the beginning, while she was a student. And she never wavered from those. But what she did is she continually reinterpreted them. She continually looked at them from a different angle, either through the way she worked jointly through the way she worked with the plaster and the forms that she created. So forms, by forms I mean the shapes. What she did with the shapes, how she created the surfaces. The surfaces of the sculpture are very important because they are very expressive. They are emotional. The shapes are emotional, but the surfaces are also very emotional because that's what the light hits. After she left Chelsea, she did a little bit of teaching, but she set up very early a studio in London, and she married a young architect assistant called Michel Jamet, who came from a French family that was settled in Ireland, Southern Ireland, and so with him she also did quite a lot of travelling in Ireland, and she's very interested in myths, not in terms of the story of the myth, but how the fact that human beings constantly express themselves through myths. Things we can't explain about our actions, the way we function in the world. We have all these sort of myths that become metaphors for the way that we function. And in particular, there are a lot of myths associated with man's capacity for brutality to another human being, our capacity for war, or our capacity for atrocities, but linked to that as well, also our vulnerability. So those are core things to Liz's work. So when we look here, we've presented the myths. We've presented them through these male figures. So here we have a standing man. The standing man is definitely the watcher. He is a silent watcher. He's watching us, watching the world, watching the human race, sort of the quiet observer. We have a running man. The running man is the fugitive. He is the fugitives we have today as well, who are escaping from horrendous situations in their own countries and trying to escape from that. We have the heads. So the heads are vessels. The heads are vessels for our thoughts. And the head forms sort of change throughout. And we have the animals that we're probably closest to, i.e. our domesticated animals. So we have horses and dogs. And then we have the metamorphic figures here. So we have the birdmen, the birds that are the birds that are almost beast. So we have bird beast. We have the flying man, the bird man, and another bird man there. They are not maquettes. They are sculptures in their own right. And Liz was such a great sculptor, that meant that she was capable of thinking through an idea on a miniature scale, much like a miniature painter would do something, or much like a writer would write a poem. If you think about these miniatures, they're the equivalent of the writer who's writing a poem. And if you think about the large pieces, they are the equivalent of the writer who's writing a novel. So, and she was embracing both those ways of working, because it helped her think about how she felt about the world and how she felt about us as human beings and what we did to the world. If you look at the animals, there's a huge sense of the animal in them. They are not accurate representations of a horse. It's like the figures. They are not measured drawings, measured sculptures of a person where, the proportions between the knee and the leg and the torso or the head or anything have to be right. They are the essence of the human being, and these are the essence of the animal. And gradually what she came to feel was actually what I've sort of taken as a sort of biological sort of expression, which is this concept, this modern day concept, which is like the equivalence of species. By that it means that there isn't a hierarchy. You know, one species isn't better than another. As human beings, we're not better than anything else in the world. We're just all sharing the same sort of planet. And if you start to think that way, then it means that then if you don't believe there are hierarchies across species or within the sort of planet, then how can you establish hierarchies within one species, i.e. the human species? How can you say one human being is better than another, one skin colour is better than another, one place in the world, one religion is better than another? So it equalises everything. And that is the sort of direction that she was sort of constantly moving to and through her work throughout her lifetime. And in the last years of her life, she sort of adopted this, or became very interested in this motif of the baboon. And so this drawing is very central to that, in the fact that you have the baboon who's sitting there, who's this sort of got all the dignity, and you've got the human man, the human animal, that's man, male, female, whatever, the human animal, sort of holding out its hands, sort of asking for help. You know, how do we become more humane? How do we become less reliant on violence? How do we become civilized? The framework for this exhibition was to tell the story of her commissions. So she had 33 public commissions, which have gone out into all sorts of public spaces, and on the whole are largely still there. And those pieces have gone out into public places since the early 50s, right up until just a few weeks before she died in 1993. And I'm personally very interested in how people react to sculpture in the street or in a building, because it's moved from being in a gallery like this, or in someone's private home. It belongs to everybody. It's out there in the street, and it's living a life, like we're living a life. And it starts its life in terms of how we're shaping our society. So after the Second World War, there were huge numbers of bombed cities, city centres, bombed buildings. There was a real desire that started back before the war, because of the Industrial Revolution, to improve people's living conditions. And so there was this utopian vision to move people out of inner cities and move them into more green spaces with fresh air. And so all the new towns were built. So, and Liz, right from the start, and there were lots of new churches built as well, and the new churches were going to be not the old sort of medieval churches where you've got the sort of cross pattern, and you have the high altar, and when they were first built, the sort of congregation were down here, and the priests were the only people allowed near the high altar, and then gradually that changed. This was a revolutionary view of how you would worship together. So on the whole, circular buildings were built with very little decoration, and with the way that the altar would be there and the congregation was allowed to be part of that. And so if you think of the new Coventry Cathedral, this photograph sort of shows it sort of very well. That's a crucifixion that she sort of made, where the altar is there and the congregation are around it. So there's no separation. It's a sort of social worship. So we have commissions for new towns, we have commissions for bombed out cities, we have commissions for new churches, new schools, new airports, all those sorts of things. And Liz was receiving commissions for all of those. So she didn't stop. She didn't think, oh right, I've been given a commission and what am I going to make for it? What she did was she gave a proposal to the commissioners which continued the area that she was interested in. So it could be that she was interested at that point in sort of metamorphosis and the idea of a birdman. It could be that she was interested in the relationship between a human being and a human species and an animal species. It could be that she was just interested in the sort of animal, all sorts of different things. And as I say, those have survived in various forms and are very potent in their place. And she's quite unique, I think, in terms of that they have become so popular in those places. People have embraced them as their sculpture. So whereas people might come in and they might love a piece of sculpture in a gallery, when it's actually in your street, in your shopping centre, in your church, in your school, you feel it belongs to you. And so that's what we've been sort of looking at quite a lot in this exhibition, telling the story of those 33 commissions, looking at her work. So having introduced the themes and the ways that she worked, and if you like, sort of created this space where you just had this immediate emotional connection with those sculptures, I decided to use this space to look at what I've called sacred space. Now, someone asked me a very good question in there, was she religious? She was not a practicing Catholic or practicing Church of England girl or anything like that. Her views were strongly humanist. And so when she was asked to do a commission for a church, she had a very particular way of responding to that, but also, by the nature of it, she was also creating sculptures that were very much about other sorts of spiritual presences. And one thing that she was interested, she sort of questioned very early on, is our concept of what makes a hero. So quite often in sort of history and even today, the warrior is often perceived as the hero, the person who's fighting for us, the sort of heroic figure who's returned from battle. Liz looked at that in a very different way, as many people have, and started to look at the people who have perhaps been imprisoned for their religious feelings, or their political feelings, who have gone through torture, who have gone through sort of, those repressive regimes, and somehow emerged at the other side, and emerged as with actually some sort of strength. It doesn't mean that they're not vulnerable and that they haven't been through something absolutely horrific, but she saw in them as the more relevant heroic figure. And so in this room, we're looking at that concept. And so we have commissions that she made for churches. So we have a head of Christ. Now he is not, if you saw him out of concept, you might not think it's a head of Christ because he doesn't look like the normal, bearded, long flowing hair sort of paintings that are associated with the head of Christ. He probably goes back slightly more, he's more universal. There is this sort of sense of, I suppose, of suffering as well, really, with his eyes closed and sort of internalizing. To the side of him, we've got the tribute head to the right-hand side. The tribute heads, there are 4 tribute heads, and they were made for Amnesty International. And they are tributes for prisoners of conscience. And one of them became the memorial for Nelson Mandela while he was imprisoned on Robben Island. Here we have Mary. Now we tend to sort of think that Mary is sort of very much within the sort of church tradition, but actually in terms of the Church of England, since the Reformation they've had real problems with Mary, and so actually she got sort of not wiped out, but certainly some of the religious ceremonies and the liturgy and the other things that were around her stopped happening. So she created this figure of Mary, which was immediately controversial when it was placed in front of Salisbury Cathedral, because she's not the Madonna holding the baby, she's not the mother of Jesus who's rising up into heaven, She is not the mother of Jesus who's been told by the angel that she's going to give birth to Jesus. She is a completely new version of Mary. And actually, what she is she is the mother whose son has just been killed. And somehow she has found the courage from goodness knows where to carry on being in the world and go on out. So she's leaving. She's not sheltering within the confines of the church. She's actually somehow getting out there, and goodness knows how you find the courage to do that, but that's what Liz is putting there. So some people didn't like it at all because they said she's turning her back on the church. Some people didn't like it because she's sort of like, there is no liturgy to go with Mary, so how do we fit her into this sort of church sort of practice and things like that. She's always been incredibly controversial. She's not cosy. She's not the cosy, soft, rounded, maternal, sort of young sort of mother with the sort of baby. That is Liz's only female sculpture, where she's sort of done that. And then here we have the eagle that she did for Coventry Cathedral. So when they were rebuilding, and she was incredibly young then, when they were building Coventry Cathedral, Basil Spence came and asked her to make the eagle for the eagle lectern. She also made 2 other pieces for that cathedral, but we have, what I would say is we haven't lifted the sculptures that are in the places. If they're unique, we've left them there. Because she worked on these big stories, there are other related pieces that might be smaller or within the same family of stories, if you like. There may be drawings within that family of that story. So this was cast in edition of 3. One is at Coventry Cathedral with a sort of rack on it that the book sits on. When John F. Kennedy was assassinated, one was bought and cast for the John F. Kennedy Memorial in Dallas, and this is in private ownership, so we've borrowed that. We have very difficult, again, a difficult sort of area for the church, and that is what do you do with Judas? It's sort of essential, but it's slightly uncomfortable. So we have a Judas drawing, and we have this little smaller figure. She did a very large piece that's called Judas, and then she also did a few this piece and some drawings which show the vulnerability of Judas in a way. Really, he's sort of fending off, his so-called portrayed Jesus, but is actually quite vulnerable, and so he's sort of fending off the world as well. So there's always this push-pull, and there's always so many ways that you can interpret a Frink sculpture. And that I feel is important. There isn't one way of interpreting it. Everybody can bring their own sort of story. That is a maquette. That was the altar cross that was made to stand on the altar, but was inspired by the larger hanging piece. And you can see in that, again, you haven't got a typical Jesus type sort of figure. It's bared down to the essence. And I'm sure that's why Liz got commissions from all denominations of churches, a huge range of churches. So sort of Church of England, Catholic, all sorts of other denominations. And then significantly, at some point, towards the sort of midpoint in her career, mid to late point in her career, when she was living in Dorset, she became interested in the idea of putting together groups of figures, often on a large scale, but she worked out lots of these so this is an early study for what became the Dorset Martyrs. So he is one of the Dorset Martyrs. So these are sort of dedicated to a series of men, a group of men who throughout the sort of 16th and 17th century were burned at the stake for their religious beliefs. And they became known as the sort of Dorset Martyrs, and that was an important commission that happened. And those pieces are sort of stand in a rather wonderful spot in Dorchester. And to be thinking about how you when you've got a group, then you actually move around them yourself. And so she was sort of playing with that, and she'd actually arrange in her studio in the garden in Dorset different arrangements of the sculptures to see what it felt like once, how it felt as you came up close to them, how you moved through them, all those things. And then this head over there is called Easter Head, and that is when she was first diagnosed with cancer and started her first lot of chemotherapy. She was given this book about the Green Man, which is all about resurrection, regeneration, new life. And she did a series of sculptures. She did a Green Man sculpture, and she did these Easter heads, which is about really life sort of going on. She had absolutely no assistants. She never worked with an assistant. She wasn't Henry Moore or Barbara Hepworth, who would do a small model and then say, here, I'll make it, or Damien Hirst send a fax, here, I'll make it 30 feet tall. Every bit has been shaped by her, a model. Every bit of the surface has got her hand to it, and her mind and her sensitivity. So here, she's sort of adding to the feeling. So she's a very expressive artist, through the eyes, through the stance, through the shape, but particularly through all the different surfaces that she's creating. So those two galleries were very much sort of introducing you to Frink's sculpture, the way she worked, and also, as I said, to be sort of in the presence of them, really, and to make your own decisions and feelings about them. In this gallery, we're using this gallery to actually tell the story of the commissions. So this introduces it in terms of post-war Britain. We've got this film because one thing that was happening in post-war Britain was actually there was this big socialist movement to move art out of galleries and into people's places, and so there are a whole set of sculpture exhibitions in the parks in London. And very early on, Liz was selected to have a piece by her in this exhibition. This is it, Seated Man. She didn't have much money, so it was cast in plaster, and then she sealed it, and it went out into the park and didn't survive really. But people saw it, and she was among some of the greats like Giacometti and Rodin and Archipenko and all those really important post-war and pre-war sort of sculptors. And this piece is her first commission. So her first commission, all her early commissions were cast in concrete because there was not money to cast it in bronze. This is St John Bosco. It was done for a new school, a church and a village hall in a place near sort of Reading. And about 10 to 15 years after it had been there, a lorry ran into it apparently, and we had it recorded as lost. It was meant to have been destroyed. So for 50 years we had thought it had been destroyed and we didn't think it existed anymore. And then I sort of initiated a sort of search for it about 4 years ago, and just before Christmas last year we discovered it. You can see two little footprints there. That's where the little boy was destroyed, but this survived. And it had a very strange journey as a sort of piece that I suppose probably sold as a piece of concrete garden statuary or something like that. It went to an auction house, it went to an antique dealer or a junk dealer, it got bought, and when the catalogue raisonné came up, we had a phone call from someone saying, I think I've got this. And so we've had it conserved, and now here it is. So it's the first time it's, been sort of seen. So that was a great thing. And the concrete is extraordinary. It's so exciting because we know she cast in concrete, but we had no idea what the concrete looked like. So she cast it in concrete using a very high alumina dark concrete. This is why it's sort of black. And then she painted it with these various surfaces. So first of all with the brown, and then this sort of overpainting of a sort of white. And there were quite a lot of sculptors at that time who were working in concrete after the war, and they tended to use a very similar sort of technique. All her other sculptures, concrete sculptures, either got cast later on in bronze or they got replaced by another sculpture by her for the same commission. Her first major public commissions, in a way, really were Blind Beggar and Dog and Wild Boar. Blind Beggar and Dog was done for Bethnal Green for a bombed out area during the Blitz, and what happened is lots of modernist building, landscaping went in, whereas instead of having houses in rows and single, sort of double story, they're set around in clusters. They're sort of leaning towards garden cities. So there's green spaces, there's places to play, but they're also all different sizes and shapes of flats and houses and other things. And Blind Beggar is a major feature and is now a listed monument for London. Obviously, there's only one Blind Beggar, but the dog was then cast in addition, and that is Blind Beggar's dog there. Harlow was one of the early new towns, and she was asked to make a wild boar, and that is the wild boar that she made for Harlow. And you can see that drawing was very important to Liz, because she was thinking through ideas with drawings. This is an original print. Her drawing she took into original prints. So these are not mass-produced prints, these are prints that are working with a print studio and working in various sort of mediums. So, but we only have one original print. And then this shows you that also when she was interested in a subject, how she would explore it on a much smaller scale. So we have the tiny little boar here as well. This is a birdman. She's very interested in this idea of our invulnerability, our sort of feeling that, we can do anything we like. And there was this man who's shown on the film that's in the Anglia Gallery called Leo Valentin, who was known as the Birdman, and he used to literally throw himself out of an aeroplane, free fly with these wings, and then pull a parachute. And at one point the wings hit the fuselage of the aeroplane, and he just crashed to his death in front of I don't know how many thousands of people at an air show in Liverpool. And she found a photograph. She was quite interested, very interested in photojournalism. She found this image of Birdman, and so she used that as an image, this idea of flight and our sort of sense that somehow, like Icarus, that we're invulnerable, we can do whatever we like. And in that same journal that she found the photograph of Leo Valentin, the front cover of that is the dropping of the first hydrogen bomb, the testing of the first hydrogen bomb. And I think there's a sort of close correlation between those sort of images. Animals became sort of invested really with a sort of sense of the joy that is in life, in our life as human beings, but also their sense of dignity and our relationship with horses, with other animals. And so she revisited the idea of the sort of man-animal relationship through horse and rider many times. And so we've included some of those. So that's the first commission that she did for that was here. And that's the one that's shown outside the gallery before you come. That's Horse and Rider, 1974. It was made for an office block. Now it's sitting amongst all the coffee drinkers at Cafe Nero. This was a smaller piece that she worked on that same idea. So again, it's this relationship, our dependence on the natural world, the fact that we are part of the natural world, we're not some sort of superior species. And then this is a much later Horse and Rider from when she was at Woolland and when she's experimenting with colour. And she started to bring colour into her sculptures after a visit to Australia, where she saw lots of Aboriginal artwork, and also she was very captivated by the colour of the earth. This shows the scale of work that she often did by herself. This is Risen Christ, and this is Liz, about 3 weeks before she died. And apart from a young man coming to help her build the armature, even though she was going through all this chemo, she carved every bit of that surface and created that amazing piece that then got cast into bronze and then goes on the front of Liverpool Cathedral. When Liz died, she was, in the last years of her life, many years of her life, she spent at Woolland in Dorset, and she had a purpose-built studio made for her there, as well as the grounds where she could play around with juxtapositions of sculptures and see how they related to one another and things. When she died, the studio was there as if she'd just walked out of the door and not come back. Tools were still laid out. It was very, very moving. So when you first went into it after she had died, there was a real sense of presence and absence. And it was recorded photographically, and we have this very good photographic record of exactly how Woolland Studio looked after the last time she'd been in there. So what I did for this exhibition, because it is a very special private place, and it does help to, it helps you to connect to her as a person. We've even got her music. I mean, I was finding CDs that haven't been opened since 1993, I suppose, and we were sort of playing this. So the last person who listened to that music was Liz. And then, of course, when she was playing music, she would write down any names of composers and bits of music she liked, as like graffiti walls. So we found those. So everything, the tools, the plasters, the furniture, the furnishings, you know, everything was sort of packed up. And we've brought a little taste of that to Nottingham.